Okay, think about this. Imagine trying to build, well, pretty much anything complex, like a civilization, without packaging.
Hmm.
No cardboard boxes, no plastic crates, definitely no big metal drums.
Hmm.
How do you move stuff?
But
How do you store food or liquids?
yeah, it's a fundamental problem. And for thousands of years, I mean, from ancient Egypt all the way up to colonial times and beyond, the answer was almost always the same thing.
A wooden barrel?
Exactly. And the person, the skilled artisan who actually made these absolutely essential containers, the trade that really underpinned almost all commerce and, daily life, that was the cooper.
So today, that's what we're diving into, the world of coopering. We've gathered quite a stack of sources here. Fascinating stuff. Historical text talking about ancient tools like the adze.
Oh, yeah, the adze is amazing.
Right. And details on colonial trade, the really intricate process of making a barrel step by step, and even how this ancient craft still shapes the taste of things we drink today, like whiskey.
Our mission really is to unpack all of that, the history, the super specialized tools, the clever techniques, and just how vital coopers were. We want to get why they were such indispensable artisans for literally millennia, how the trade changed, and what the key takeaways are for you listening today.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning. Who exactly was a cooper?
Well, fundamentally, a cooper is someone who makes wooden vessels. We usually think of barrels, but also casks, tubs, buckets, that kind of thing.
Right.
They use specifically shaped boards called staves, and these are held together tightly by hoops, which could be wood originally or later metal, and then sealed up with flat ends called heads.
Okay, so it's a very specific kind of woodworking then. It's not like a carpenter nailing straight planks together.
Yeah.
I remember seeing in the sources, they compared the adze, that key cooper's tool, with the blade set sideways.
Perpendicular to the handle.
Right, perpendicular. They compared it to a mattock, which is more for digging, just to show how unique that tool setup is.
Exactly. And, the sheer importance of this trade historically, it kind of echoes even today. Just think about how common the last name Cooper is.
Ah, yeah, that's true.
That popularity, it's a direct reflection of just how widespread and, frankly, essential the job was. If you look at old city directories, say from the 1800s, Cooper isn't just a name people had. It was frequently listed right there as a profession, a common, necessary trade in basically any town.
And that necessity, it came from the fact that barrels were just the universal container, wasn't it? We sort of picture them now for, I don't know, whiskey aging or maybe pirate movies.
Right, treasure chests or something.
Yeah. But they held, well, everything.
Truly everything. The list is kind of mind-boggling when you see it laid out. Flour, grains, salted meats, salted fish, crucial for preservation water, especially vital for sea voyages.
Couldn't sail without water barrels.
Absolutely not. Then nails, beer, spirits, whale oil, cotton, produce, apples, pears, sugar, cranberries, even laundry soap. I mean, if it needed to be stored in bulk, measured out, shipped somewhere, or traded, it probably went into a barrel.
Just try to imagine the logistics of, say, a busy colonial port like Charleston.
Right.
Or just outfitting a ship for months at sea before you had refrigeration or modern canning.
Right.
Without sturdy, reliable barrels made by skilled coopers, I mean, commerce and long-distance travel as they knew it, it just wouldn't have worked. The cooper wasn't just some craftsman off to the side. They were like a linchpin of the whole pre-industrial economy.
And the skill level needed and the type of barrel required that often led to specialization within the craft itself. The main split was between wet coopers and dry coopers.
Okay, what was the difference there? What set them apart?
So wet coopers, they were kind of the elite of the trade. They made the barrels and casks that had to hold liquids.
The really tricky ones.
Exactly. Wine, beer, spirits, water, oil, anything where a leak meant disaster. You lost your product, ruined other cargo maybe. So this demanded really dense hardwoods like oak, chestnut, or beech, and just incredibly precise shaping and fitting of those staves to get a perfect watertight seal.
So their whole focus was that ultimate tight seal.
That was goal number one. Dry coopers, on the other hand, they made barrels for, well, dry goods, flour, grain, salt, nail, stuff like that.
Right.
These didn't need that same absolute level of watertight integrity. The fit could be a bit less demanding, let's say, so they could often use cheaper woods, maybe pine or fir, and the construction could generally be faster, which was important, for commodity goods where you needed high volume.
So just knowing if someone was a wet or dry cooper told you a lot about what their barrels were for and the materials they'd be working with.
Precisely. And this whole craft, it has roots that go back, well, millennia. We're not just talking colonial America here.
Really? How far back did the sources actually take us?
Oh, it's ancient. Some sources cite it going back over 4,000 years, maybe even 5,000 years.
Wow. For a wooden barrel, that's incredible history.
It really is. And we see hints of it in early historical accounts. Herodotus, the Greek historian, back in 485 BC, he described people using casks made of palm wood to ship wine.
Palm wood, huh?
Yeah. And maybe even more interestingly, around 350 BC, the Celts were apparently already using watertight barrels that had that distinctive bulge in the middle.
Ah, the bulge. Okay, I've always wondered about that. It looks so specific. Why did they make them bulge like that?
The bulge, or the bilge, as it's called, it's actually a brilliant piece of ancient engineering. For one thing, it helps the barrel handle internal pressure better, especially from liquids pushing outwards.
Hmm.
That curved shape distributes the force more evenly across all the staves and the hoops, reduces stress points.
Okay, makes sense. Like an arch.
Sort of, yeah. But it also makes the barrels way easier to handle. A bulged barrel rests on a much smaller surface area when it's on its side. That makes it easier to roll, to pivot, to maneuver around a warehouse or a ship's hold. Just try rolling a perfectly straight cylinder versus one with a bilge. You'll see the difference immediately.
So the Celts figured out this optimal shape thousands of years ago. That's amazing.
It is. And the Romans, they later adopted it and really spread the technology across their empire. That's where we actually get the name cooper from the Latin cuparius. Roman artisans got very skilled at making these wooden containers, especially for their massive wine industry.
Right, wine was huge for them.
Huge. Pliny the Elder even gave credit to the people in Piedmont in northern Italy for inventing oak wine casks, which was apparently a massive step up from using fragile pottery or, leaky animal hides for storing and shipping wine over long distances. We also see evidence that early Egyptian traders were using oak barrels held together with hoops for shipping stuff like wheat.
And speaking of ancient Egypt, that brings us back to that tool you mentioned right at the start, the adze. It seems like the adze has its own incredibly long and, frankly, surprising history that's tied into this.
It truly does. The adze is one of the oldest tools we know of. It's a cutting tool, kind of like an axe, but the key difference is the blade is mounted perpendicular sideways to the handle,
Okay.
and it's been used since the Stone Age.
I see pictures of it going way back to ancient Egypt.
Absolutely. The adze shows up prominently in ancient Egyptian art, right from the Old Kingdom period onwards. That tells you how important it was in all sorts of crafts, especially woodworking. Early on, the blades were stone, but they pretty quickly moved to copper in the predynastic period, and then later to bronze. Even the way they attached the blades evolved, from just tying them on to more secure methods like having an eye hole through the blade itself in the later Bronze Age.
And the sources mention some really unexpected cultural stuff connected to the adze in Egypt, not just practical use.
This is where the history gets really wild. It wasn't just a tool. Its image, the picture of an adze, was actually used as a hieroglyph.
No way.
Yeah. It represented the sounds ST, which meant chosen. You'd see it in royal titles like Pharaoh so-and-so, chosen of the god Ra, or something like that.
So a symbol of divine selection based on a woodworking tool. Wow.
And maybe even more amazing, an instrument shaped like an adze called the anedger was used in a really important ritual called the opening of the mouth ceremony.
What was that?
It was this profound ritual they performed on statues or even mummies to symbolically animate them, to restore their senses, sight, hearing, speech, so they could function in the afterlife. And the tool they used for this, the anedger, was often depicted as looking like the foreleg of a freshly sacrificed bull or cow, and they'd wield it in an adze-like motion towards the statue's mouth. It's just an incredible link between a basic craftsman's tool and some really deep religious beliefs.
That detail alone is worth the price of admission. So this ancient tool, with practical uses and even these symbolic meanings in Egypt, it's spread out from there.
Oh, yeah. As technology like ironworking advanced and as populations migrated, especially moving south from Egypt into other parts of Africa, the adze went with them. Iron adzes are actually still used in some rural parts of Africa today for all sorts of things, digging, chopping wood, even tilling fields.
And its reach went way beyond Africa, across continents.
Definitely. If you look over in New Zealand, the prehistoric Maori people were incredible master carvers. They used adzes made from really highly valued stone, like Ponomo jade, but also basalt, greywacke, argillite. These tools were absolutely essential for creating their intricate wood carvings. There's even this unique story from Henderson Island, out in the Pacific. Apparently stone wasn't readily available there, so the inhabitants might have actually fashioned adzes out of giant clamshells.
Giant clamshell adzes. Now that's resourceful.
Talk about making do with what you've got. And then up on the northwest coast of North America, the indigenous peoples there used adzes constantly for functional things like carving canoes and bowls, but also for their famous artistic works, masks, totem poles.
Right, the totem poles.
Exactly. They had different forms of adzes. Some were hafted like the European style, using a naturally crooked branch for the handle. Others had a more direct D-shaped handle attached right to the iron blade. They even classified them by size and the shape of the blade: straight, gutter-shaped, lipped, using smaller, specialized adzes, along with something called a crooked knife for that really fine smoothing you see in detailed carvings.
So from basic function to high art, the adze was just fundamental.
Totally. And you find similar stories in places like New Guinea and Melanesia. They had groundstone adzes shaped on river rocks, fixed to handles with resin and plant fibers. Those were their primary tools for ages. Although, interestingly, they often got replaced by imported steel tools like axes and machetes through trade networks even before Europeans made direct contact. But some stone tools are still made there today, often more as cultural items or curios now.
So the adze. It's this ancient, incredibly versatile, globally used tool that eventually becomes just indispensable for specific skilled crafts, like coopering.
Precisely. It became a core piece of that specialized toolkit you'd find in any cooper's workshop.
Okay, let's step into that workshop then. What would it have looked like? What was the vibe?
Well, early on in Europe, cooperages might have even been set up outdoors, maybe in city markets or under the arches of public buildings. Good natural light was key.
Makes sense.
In colonial America, coopers more often worked indoors, maybe in barns or dedicated workshops, but usually with big open doors, again, for light.
And becoming a cooper, learning the trade, it wasn't exactly a weekend course, was it?
Oh, far from it.
Mhm.
It involved a really rigorous apprenticeship, especially in colonial America. Typically, it lasted 7 years.
7 years.
Yeah, and the apprentices often lived right there, quartered in the workshop or the master cooper's house. They'd learn skills piece by piece, maybe start with just roughing out wood, then move to hollowing the inside of staves, then shaping the outside, until the master finally decided they were skilled enough to tackle making a whole barrel from start to finish.
That idea of one person, one barrel seems really central to the craft, at least initially.
It was initially. A single cooper would take a barrel, basically from a pile of shaped wood all the way to the finished product. This really fostered deep individual skill, and it meant that efficient coopers could potentially earn more because they were often paid per cask they completed. Now, later on, especially in bigger cooperages, while one cooper might still be kind of responsible for seeing a barrel through, they might share certain tools or use dedicated stations for specific steps. But, because every single stave was unique, maybe has slightly different grain or curve, it never really became a true factory assembly line in the modern sense. Not initially, anyway. It always needed that individual attention.
So even in a bigger shop, there was still a massive amount of individual craft involved.
Absolutely. And the complexity of making that curved, watertight vessel demanded a very specific set of tools. Unlike, say, a general carpenter, coopers needed tools designed just for shaping curved pieces and creating those incredibly tight joints in thick, often hardwood.
Okay, so walk us through some of the key steps in making a barrel and the specific tools they use for each part. What makes this process so unique?
All right, well, it starts with getting the wood ready. Usually they wouldn't saw planks like we might think. They'd split or rive logs along the grain. For this, they used a mallet and a tool called a froe. Yeah, it's kind of an L-shaped blade. You hammer it into the end grain of the wood, and then you twist the handle to split the wood cleanly along its natural grain lines. Riving is super important because wood split this way is much stronger and way less likely to warp than wood that's been sawn across the grain.
Oh, okay, so you're working with the wood structure from the start, getting that strong, stable piece.
Exactly. Then comes shaping those split pieces into staves. You need to create that distinctive curve, narrower at the ends, wider in the middle, that forms the bulge.
Right.
This was often done using various draw knives. You'd clamp the stave onto something called a shaving horse. It's basically a workbench you sit on, with a foot-operated clamp to hold the wood steady.
So you're pulling the draw knife blade towards you, shaving off wood to get the shape.
Yes. Hollowing out the inside curve, backing off the outside curve. But maybe the most skillful part was shaping the edges of the staves. You had to plane a very precise bevel or slope onto each edge. And this was done with a specialized, really long plane called a jointer.
A long plane, why long?
The length helps ensure a perfectly straight, consistent edge along the whole stave. And the angle of that bevel had to be calculated perfectly. It's different depending on where the stave sits in the circle of the barrel. Getting that angle just right is absolutely essential for all the staves to fit together tightly with no gaps. It took incredible precision and, frankly, years of experience to get it right by eye.
That makes total sense. Every single edge has to mate perfectly with the one next to it to form that curve and hold liquid.
Right. So once you have your set of shaped staves, you start assembling them. This is called rising up. You basically stand staves up vertically inside a temporary metal hoop on the floor called a raising up hoop. Maybe add another temporary hoop lower down.
Okay.
Then comes the really dramatic step, trussing. The partially assembled barrel held by these temporary hoops is placed over a heat source, a small fire pit called a cresset, often fueled just by wood shavings from the shaping process. Sometimes they'd add water to create steam.
To make the wood bendable, right?
Precisely. The heat and the steam make the wood fibers pliable. Then, using more temporary truss hoops and often ropes connected to a windlass or pulley system, they'd gradually pull the tops of the staves together, forcing them into that classic barrel shape. As they pulled, they'd hammer the truss hoops further down the narrowing cone of staves.
Wow, that sounds intense.
It was. The cooper had to know exactly when the wood was ready, judging by the color of the smoke or the sheen on the wood. They'd often flip the barrel to heat it evenly. Once it cooled down and dried in that shape, the wood would set, holding its curve permanently. At that point, it's sometimes called a gun.
Like the barrel is loaded into its final form. Clever.
Kind of, yeah. Then they focus on the ends of the staves. They need to be shaped to angle slightly inward. That's called the chime. This was partly done with an adze, carefully trimming the ends. Then they'd level the ends perfectly flat using a topping plane or a sun plane. And then comes maybe the most critical cut, the crows. This is that V-shaped groove cut into the inside surface of the staves near the ends. It's cut with a very specialized tool called a crow's plane. And that groove is where the barrel heads are going to sit to make the seal. It's one of the defining features of a proper coopered barrel.
So that crow's groove is absolutely key for holding the head in place and making it watertight.
Absolutely essential. Meanwhile, the heads themselves are made separately. They'd measure carefully, often using diagonals inside the barrel end to calculate the diameter needed for the right volume. Then they'd cut circles out of flat boards using a compass to mark, and maybe a bow saw or a specialized saw called a swift.
What if the head was too wide for one board?
Good question. Often they needed multiple boards to make a head wide enough. In that case, they'd join the boards together edge to edge using wooden dowels. And they'd often insert some kind of sealing material, like dried reeds flagging, or rush into the joints between the headboards for extra water tightness. Then, the edges of the circular head were carefully shaped with a double bevel, called a basal, designed to fit perfectly into that crow's groove.
It really sounds like every single step had to be just right. A carefully orchestrated process.
It really was. And then came fitting the heads. Often, they'd drill a larger hole, the bung hole, in one of the staves first. They could then insert the head through that hole or just maneuver it inside before the last stave was placed. Then they'd use a special heading tool to carefully lever and pull the head into position, getting that beveled edge seated snugly into the crow's groove at both ends of the barrel. Finally, the temporary truss hoops could be removed. The outside of the barrel might be smoothed with a plane or a shave, like a buzz plane. And then the permanent hoops, either wood, especially earlier on, or riveted metal, were hammered firmly into place using a hammer and a specialized driver tool to seat them tightly.
It is so much more involved than just, banging some boards together.
Yeah.
The sources estimated, it took around 15 hours for one cooper to make a single barrel start to finish.
That's right. That traditional one-person, one-barrel way was incredibly labor-intensive. Although you do see some examples, like Thomas Jefferson noted his coopers at his grist mill could turn out maybe 5 flour barrels a day. That suggests there might have been some specialization happening, or maybe a division of labor. Perhaps enslaved workers were doing the really hard, rough preparation of the staves, getting them ready for the skilled cooper to do the fine fitting and assembly. But even in the larger cooperages that developed later, while tools might be shared or you might have stations for certain tasks, the fact that every stave was still unique meant a fully automated assembly line wasn't really possible, not in the early days. It always relied heavily on the individual cooper's judgment and skill.
And this incredibly intricate, highly skilled process, it fueled this enormous economic engine, particularly back in the colonial era.
Oh, the demand was just staggering. The sources give us some amazing numbers. Virginia, just one colony, was apparently producing over 300,000 barrels every year.
300,000.
Yeah. And Charleston, South Carolina, a major port. In just one year, 1754, something like 116,000 barrels passed through its harbor.
That's just a mind-blowing scale of production and trade happening entirely based on barrels.
And it wasn't only finished barrels being shipped around. The export of the raw staves themselves, the pre-shaped pieces of wood, was a huge business. From places like the James River area in Virginia, tens, sometimes hundreds of thousands of staves were shipped out every year, mostly to Europe, for coopers over there to assemble into barrels. This was a really vital part of the colonial economy, and also a source of income for farmers who were clearing land that could sell the timber for staves.
We talked earlier about the basic split between wet and dry coopers, but the sources broke down the types of barrels even further, didn't they? Showing just how varied the products were to meet all these different needs.
Yes, absolutely. The specific design, the wood used, the construction quality, it all varied greatly depending on what the barrel was meant to hold and how durable it needed to be. Way down at the lower skill end, you had things called gum containers. These were basically just hollowed out logs. Very primitive, less skill involved, used by some Native American groups and maybe some very early farmers. But you couldn't make many of them easily because it was so laborious. Not really the iconic barrel shape at all.
No.
Then you had piggins. These were more like small pails or tubs made with staves, but often one stave was left extra long to act as a handle, used for small-scale stuff like carrying milk from the cow or water from the well.
Okay. And the really big ones, hogsheads. You mentioned those.
Right, hogsheads. These were very large, usually cylindrical barrels, often 4.5 feet tall. They were used mainly in the southern colonies for packing dried tobacco leaves for export. Importantly, they were slack, meaning not watertight. They were typically made with straight staves of even width, so they didn't have that bilge bulge, because they didn't need that super tight seal for liquids, making them required less skill. And on the big southern plantations, it was frequently enslaved people who were tasked with making hogsheads, often with minimal training, just to handle the sheer volume of tobacco that needed packing.
That's another really clear example of how the demands of a specific commodity, like tobacco, shaped the labor and the skill levels within the coopering trade itself.
Definitely. Then you get to the two main categories we already touched on, slack or dry barrels. These had the classic bilge shape and were the workhorses for all sorts of dry goods: grain, salt, flour, nails, apples. Softer woods were often okay for these, and while they needed to be well made, they didn't require that absolute watertight seal of the wet barrels. This meant they could be produced faster, maybe 10 a day for a skilled cooper. Less experienced coopers, apprentices, even found families might help assemble these.
The everyday container for bulk commodities.
Pretty much. And then the top tier, tight or wet barrels, also bilge-shaped, but usually made with thicker staves of hardwood and requiring the absolute highest level of skill and jointing to achieve that perfect watertight seal. These were for all the liquids: cider, beer, spirits, molasses, water, but also for valuable dry goods that absolutely had to be kept dry, like gunpowder or high-quality flour. These were essential for any kind of seafaring.
And finally, there was one more category mentioned, the white cooper.
Right. White cooperage was a bit different. These artisans often worked in smaller towns and made a wider variety of utilitarian containers, but typically not the standard bulged barrels. Think things like grain measures, small casks for butter or fish called firkins, sieves, wooden boxes, maybe even parts for things like drums or bellows, or even wooden shoes, clogs. They often used thinner strips of wood, sometimes held together with tacks and simple bands. It generally required a lower skill level than making tight barrels.
It's just fascinating how incredibly diverse the needs were for wooden containers back then, and how the trade specialized and adapted to meet every single one of them.
And you know, a huge, constant challenge in that world before modern preservation was just keeping things from spoiling. Barrels helped, obviously, but they weren't a magic bullet. Salt-cured meat and fish packed in brine barrels could last for months, which was amazing for the time, but spoilage was still a constant risk.
Yeah, I remember the sources mentioning the Pilgrims.
That's a harsh example. They arrive in Massachusetts in 1630 after a 6 or 8 week voyage, only to find that much of the food they'd brought with them in barrels had spoiled during the trip. That contributed significantly to the terrible food shortages and hardship they faced that first winter, a stark reminder of the limits.
Even with well-made barrels, preservation was tough.
Exactly. And think about reusing barrels. Early attempts to clean them were probably pretty basic, maybe just rinsing with water or sometimes using lye. But that was likely completely ineffective for actually sterilizing the barrel. So you had risks of contamination, bacteria lingering in the wood, tainting the next batch of food or drink. Contrast that with what came later. Canned meat in sterile metal containers started appearing in the later 1800s. That could last for years. Ice boxes, while not as cold as our refrigerators, still kept food significantly cooler than room temperature, slowing down bacterial growth. And then modern refrigeration really taking off after the 1920s and freezing technology becoming common after the 1950s. Those things truly revolutionized food safety and long-term preservation in ways people centuries ago couldn't have dreamed of. It really highlights the constant struggle they face with barrel storage for anything perishable.
Beyond just general storage, though, barrels were absolutely foundational, weren't they, for the whole beverage industry,
Hmm.
especially spirits?
Oh, absolutely critical. The aging process for spirits like scotch, bourbon, rum, brand, it happens in oak-tight casks, and that process is essential to their final flavor. Over months or usually years, compounds from the oak wood itself leach into the spirit. Things like vanillin, which gives you vanilla notes.
Ah, like in vanilla beans.
Exactly. And tannins, which provide structure, body, and a bit of dryness. These compounds smooth out the harshness of the raw spirit and add layers of complexity. Generally speaking, the longer the spirit ages in that wood, the smoother and more complex it becomes. The barrel makes the spirit in many ways.
And how the inside of the barrel is prepared makes a difference too, right? I remember reading about charring versus toasting.
Yes, that's a huge factor, especially for American whiskey like bourbon and also for some wines. Charring means the inside of the barrel is literally burned, sometimes quite deeply, creating a layer of charcoal. This does a couple of things. It caramelizes the natural wood sugars right beneath the char.
Ah,
Exactly. Which imparts sweeter notes, caramel, honey, sometimes toffee or smoky flavors, and it also contributes significantly to the dark color of whiskeys. Toasting, on the other hand, uses a gentler, slower heat. The wood is warmed deeply, but not actually burned. This brings out different compounds from the wood, often more vanilla, spice, maybe nutty notes. It generally results in a lighter color in the final spirit, and often a sharper, more wood-forward taste compared to charring. So the cooper's work in preparing that barrel directly shapes the drink you end up pouring.
and it wasn't just spirits. Another massive industry built on barrels in colonial America was apple cider. You wouldn't necessarily think of it now, but cider was huge.
Immensely popular. It's hard to overstate it. Early settlers planted apple trees specifically because they could be used to make cider. It was the staple drink for many people, and it was incredibly cheap and widely available. One source mentioned about 3 shillings for a whole 32-gallon barrel back in the 1740s.
Wow, that's cheap. Dirt cheap. And it was consumed by absolutely everyone, men, women, even children drank versions of it. It was found in pretty much every home, every tavern. Even ministers kept large stocks of it. The demand, especially in the southern colonies, was so high that apple orchards became some of the most valuable property a farmer could own. And they made pear cider, too, called perry, sometimes blending it with apple cider.
And they got creative with it, didn't they? Mixing it up.
Oh, yeah. Mixing hard cider with rum created some pretty potent drinks, like one called Stonewall. There was also cider royal, which was made by boiling down, say, 4 barrels of regular cider into just 1 barrel. That really concentrated the flavors and the alcohol. All these popular drinks, the whole industry was completely reliant on coopers cranking out enormous numbers of barrels for fermentation, for storage, and for transport.
It's just so clear that barrels weren't merely packaging. They were completely integral to entire economic sectors, and they really shaped daily consumption patterns for centuries. Absolutely. And think about the industries that grew up around them. Brewers and distillers, they employed thousands of coopers directly, often right on their premises. The scale became truly industrial. Those sources noted that in just one year, 1865, American breweries constructed something like 5 million beer barrels.
5 million.
And whiskey production in that same year hit 70 million gallons. Think of the barrels needed for that.
That's just a staggering volume, all needing a constant supply of new barrels.
And the very lucrative West Indies trade, think rum and sugar, that kept cooperages in America and Britain incredibly busy for decades. They needed a constant stream of barrels going back and forth. And it wasn't only sugar and rum. Other tropical goods like limes from Montserrat or even sea turtles were shipped north in casks.
Packing companies too, right? The ones dealing with meat, fish,
Yeah.
produce. They must have relied heavily on coopers.
Totally. Packing everything from salt beef and pork stored in brine barrels to apples, flour, you name it. There was that example in the sources of the Newcomb family up in Cleveland. They were involved in both a big provisions company on Lake Erie and they founded the Cleveland Cooperage Company. That shows you just how close that relationship was between the packers and the barrel makers.
And barrels were essential for so many other bulk goods too. Things we might not even think about, like limestone.
Yeah, the Kelly's Island Quarry up on Lake Erie apparently needed a dedicated cooper shop gang just to make barrels for shipping crushed limestone. And then there's oil. John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Refinery, also in Cleveland, built what might have been the largest single cooperage in the world at the time. It was capable of churning out an incredible 9,000 oak barrels a day just for shipping oil.
9,000 barrels
A day.
from just one company. That really brings home the immense industrial scale this trade reached at its peak.
It really does. And even businesses that maybe didn't start out focused on barrels often recognize their importance. Take the Grief family. Their story starts with Vincent Grief, who was a cooper. His son, William, actually started in the coal business, but then shifted into cooperage, eventually founding Grief Brothers, which became the world's largest barrel factory. And that company, Grief, still exists today as a global packaging giant.
Wow. From a single immigrant cooper to a modern multinational corporation.
It's an amazing story. And the Bear family in Cleveland is another great example. Jacob Bear was both a cooper and a master brewer. His son, Herman, also started out as a cooper before becoming a successful brewer himself, and eventually was even elected mayor of Cleveland. These family histories really show how that essential skill of coopering could be the foundation for building significant businesses, achieving success, and even social prominence in that growing American economy.
But, like so many traditional crafts that were once ubiquitous, the widespread need for coopers eventually started to decline, didn't it?
It did, quite significantly, really starting in the mid-20th century. New materials and new technologies came along that provided alternatives for bulk transport and storage. And these were often lighter, cheaper, or just more efficient in various ways.
Like what? What replaced the barrel?
Well, plastics were huge, obviously. Plastic containers of all shapes and sizes. Stainless steel tanks became common for liquids, especially in food processing and transport. Shipping goods strapped onto pallets became much more widespread. And maybe the biggest single replacement for general dry goods was the rise of the humble corrugated cardboard box.
Right, cardboard.
It just took over for shipping most everyday manufactured goods and dry commodities. So that ubiquitous symbol of trade, the wooden barrel, it just became much less common in daily life.
So the need for all those general-purpose barrels just sort of faded away?
Exactly. The demand for handcrafted wooden containers for most ordinary commodities just waned dramatically. However, and this is important, the craft didn't completely vanish.
Okay, so where does it hang on today? Where do we still see coopering?
Well, it definitely endures in certain specialist areas. There are still artisans who practice traditional coopering, keeping the skills alive. We talked earlier about indigenous sculptors on the Northwest Coast who continue to use adzes and related woodworking techniques for their art and functional pieces. And you have museums and historical centers, like that Somerset Historical Center mentioned in the sources, that actively preserve and demonstrate these coopering skills, sometimes even running schools.
Keeping the knowledge from being lost.
Right. But the real core of its modern relevance, where it's still a vital functioning industry, that's in the spirits, wine, and increasingly, the premium beer industries.
Because of the flavor.
Precisely. For many of these beverages, as we discussed, that aging process in oak barrels is absolutely indispensable for developing the desired flavor profile. Those specific chemical interactions between the liquid and the wood, they're crucial, and they just can't be perfectly replicated using stainless steel tanks or other materials, so that enduring demand keeps the trade of the tight cooper alive and well.
Are there still, like, large-scale cooperages operating today, then? Making barrels for whiskey and wine?
Oh, yes. Although the total number is obviously way smaller than it was back in the 1800s. But there are major players, companies like the Independent Stave Company or ISC. They operate large, modern factories. In fact, ISC recently built a huge new facility down in Kentucky, specifically to meet the booming demand from the bourbon and whiskey industry. They source high-quality oak, both from forests here in the U.S. and from France, particularly for wine barrels.
So it shows that where the barrel's unique function, especially for flavor, is still critical, the industry continues to thrive, even adapting to modern industrial scales.
Absolutely. And while hand tools are definitely still used by artisan coopers and for certain steps, it's worth remembering that even back during that big industrial boom period we talked about, the 19th century, there was significant automation starting to creep into the trade.
Right, you mentioned patents.
Yeah, between roughly 1844 and 1883, there were over 400 patents filed in the U.S. just for barrel making machines.
Over 400 patents in less than 40 years. That is incredibly rapid technological change for such an old craft.
It absolutely is. These machines were designed to automate key steps in the process, shaping staves, cutting grooves, assembling barrels, and they drastically lowered the cost per barrel. By 1880, one source estimated the cost had plummeted to just 32 cents per barrel, which is astonishing. You can even find images of some of these patents online, like for machines specifically designed just to cut that crucial crow's groove. It really shows how mechanization began to transform those super labor-intensive hand processes we detailed earlier.
It sounds like a classic story, doesn't it? A highly skilled ancient craft meets the age of industry, leads to massive efficiency gains, but also fundamentally changes the nature of the work itself.
And ultimately, it led to both a decline for the generalist cooper making everyday barrels and a continued specialized niche for the highly skilled tight cooper serving those specific markets, like spirits and wine, where the wood itself is irreplaceable.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've taken quite a journey, haven't we? From the really ancient origins of the adze, seeing it depicted in Egyptian rituals,
Amazing stuff.
all the way through to understanding coopering is this essential, incredibly skilled craft that literally built colonial economies and shaped daily life for centuries. We explored the very specific tools, that complex step-by-step process of creating the perfect barrel. We understood its absolutely vital role in trade, but also in creating the flavors of things we still enjoy today.
Right.
We saw the rise of huge industries built entirely on barrels, and even met some prominent families who got their start as humble coopers. And then finally, we witnessed the trade's transformation, its decline in many areas, but also its enduring relevance in others, right up to the modern day.
It's really a story that highlights, I think, the incredible ingenuity and the sheer necessity of craftsmanship in a world that was fundamentally different from ours. A world that relied almost totally on these wooden containers for pretty much everything, and how that shaped commerce, diet, even the cultural landscape for literally thousands of years.
Absolutely. And maybe, just maybe, the next time you see a barrel, whether it's actually aging whiskey in a distillery or maybe just used as a planter or decoration somewhere,
Yeah.
maybe you'll look at it just a little bit differently. Think about those thousands of years of history, that accumulated engineering knowledge, and the sheer skill that went into making that seemingly simple object.
And perhaps here's a final thought to chew on. Given how utterly essential barrels were for such an incredibly long stretch of human history, and recognizing how critical they still are for certain key industries, like spirits aging, what might happen if we saw unforeseen disruptions to our modern container supply chains? The plastics, the metal, the cardboard we rely on so heavily now. Could that reveal a potential, even if it's just a niche relevance, for the Cooper's fundamental skills again today? It's kind of a thought that connects this really ancient craft right back to some potential vulnerabilities in our super complex modern world.